Dude, limes.
All right. Hey, everybody. I believe we are live. Yeah. So I am Gabe Durham, and I'm the editor and publisher of Boss Fight Books, which is a press that makes books, nonfiction books about individual video games. So I'm going to be talking about making books about video games with two of my authors. I've got Jon Irwin here, who wrote a book on Super Mario Brothers 2. And I've got Michael P. Williams here, who wrote our book about Chrono Trigger. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Hello, hello.
Yeah.
My middle
This is
initial
great.
is C, by the way, if we need to
Jon
go full
It's
on.
ambiguous, John.
Irwin.
There's like 5 John
Yeah,
Irwins
there's-
about to join the chat, so just to keep us straight.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe John K. Irwin is an actor on The Wire, so that's actually really useful.
Yes. Every day I wake
So
up,
many
I'm not.
people, so many people were
That guy.
disappointed that Michael K. Williams did not write Chrono Trigger, but
I know. We were off the rails already. Here we
just
go.
to
Gabe.
So to foreground everything in obscure inside jokes, I started Boss Fight Books. Kind of had the idea. This is about a year and a half ago now, and we printed our first book, Earthbound, just over a year ago. And Michael's book, Chrono Trigger, is the second book in the series, and then John's book is the sixth. And then actually the next book coming up will be mine, which is about Bible Adventures, which is a series, the most famous of a series of unlicensed Bible games from the early 90s. So basically, when I pitch this series to people, I kind of refer to it as the 33 1/3 of video games, which means something to about, I don't know, 20% of the population. But 33 1/3 is, yeah, it's a series of books about individual albums, and a really cool series. There's over 100 of the books now, and they each take a really different take on an album, usually an album that really means something to the writer. And so, they will engage in analysis and history and get into memoir. Some of the books that they do are actually novels, which we don't do. But I love the breadth of that series. I love when I get to read longer pieces of nonfiction that take a small, or single subject and really blow it up. That tends to be really exciting to me. So I was really surprised to see that didn't exist for video games. Now, since then, there has been more. I think like long-form video games writing has been gotten to be a bigger thing even in the last 2 years, and that's been really exciting. So I guess just to I'd be really curious to hear from you guys about kind of going into your own individual books. What are kind of the first like long-form articles and/or books about video games that you guys encountered? And like when you undertook your projects, like what sources of inspiration were swirling around in your heads?
John?
Yeah, I'll start off. Well, to be fair, I mean, what Gabe you're saying is totally right, that there was no series of books kind of based on a single game, but that doesn't mean there were not single books devoted to games, or even a single game from the past. And one that I kind of stumbled upon. Well, and I mean, I agree with you that the books that I enjoyed on games did kind of span like the history of the medium. Almost all of them seem to take a historical archivist bent as far as like here's the ultimate history of games, or here's the which was fascinating to me, but I think to your point, it seemed a strange lacking that no one stayed in one place and really dug down deep. And but one game that did do that I just found in the library, I think during my initial researchings for this kind of work, is a 1982 book by David Sudnow called Pilgrim in the Microworld. Have you guys seen that?
Yeah,
or,
that shows up in your book.
I'm reading it now, halfway through.
Are you really? Okay.
No,
Yeah,
Really?
please tell us about it.
Wow.
and it's and it's and the guy has written other books about music, and he was he wasn't really a games person at all, but he stumbled upon Breakout on the Atari, and it just kind
Oh,
of took over his
yes.
life. You might have, I think other people have started talking about it in the
I've
last
heard
couple
about
of years. Yeah, but but that, I mean, that was over 30 years ago, and it was kind of like the proto boss fight book, because it was really much this one guy just breaking down this single game and how it kind of affected him. And reading that wasn't really so much of an influence, but just an eye opener as to maybe how far we have not gone as far as from a literary
it.
standpoint, like the writing about games. It's kind of stood still for the past 20 or 30 years, and maybe the last 5 years or so, it's really really matured and grown a little bit, and I think we're going to see more and more examples of this
That's
coming up.
interesting. Yeah, like maybe we're only like ready for Pilgrim in the Microworld now because we kind of have a context to talk about it. Whereas, I'd be really curious to find like what the reception was when that came out.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't know. I just wanted to bring up a couple examples of stuff that did exist, before this amazing project got started, in case other people were interested to, read other examples kind of
Yeah, absolutely.
before it's taken off. Michael, do you have any any influences or long form games writing that stuck out for you?
Well, I have to admit my experience with long-form games writing was pretty much nil until I came into the series. But I used to read about video games as kind of stories. I used to love those omnibuses that Nintendo would publish, Mario Mania, all the strategy guides that were basically like special editions of Nintendo Power. And I would just pour through those things. I bought some strategy guides for games I have never played, probably never will. I would just read these things like kind of weird fiction magazines. Always really into reading the manuals of games, so I would not start a game before I read the manual from cover to cover. I really
Really?
wanted to be
Wow.
immersed in the game and its lore. So approaching games to me has always been immersive more than analytical. So when I started looking for research materials for Chrono Trigger, I really didn't know where to go. I work in a library by day, so I had some kind of angles, but the first thing I decided I would do was to get every single strategy guide for Chrono Trigger that had been published in the US and in Japan. So I had the library spend a good $100 on 6 Chrono Trigger strategy guides from Japan, from used book dealers, and kind of just dove in from there. And I really liked approaching it from a kind of, I guess, paratextual approach of seeing what people felt about the game and how it was being marketed, because I was one of those people who would buy games based on books about them, even though they were ostensibly ways to get you to purchase the game in the first place.
Yeah. I think that's like a cool transition to what I wanted to talk about anyway, which is, I mean, because for you, Mike, I feel like that chapter of Chrono Trigger is one of the of your Chrono Trigger book is one of the ones that that seems like something only you could write, in part because like that's where Chrono Trigger and your interests really intersect. And I'd love to hear both of you, but yeah, maybe starting with Mike, like what opportunities does the length of a book afford you when you're writing a book about a single game, as opposed to like if you're just writing some brief article or review?
Well, I think with a book, I don't have to have a thesis and go on from there. With an article, I kind of need to make a point. But with a book, I can make several points, and they don't need to all flow from the main idea. I mean, that typical structure of main idea, subheading, idea, and so on, the outline just doesn't work for me. So when I started writing, I had
Right.
maybe 9 or 10 big ideas, and those were all things I thought I can write a little essay about this. So I kind of approached the book as a way of putting together individual ideas that had been fleshed out as sort of essays, and then link the essays in a way that made sense to me, which was through experience. After I read Ken and Bauman's Earthbound, just the excerpt that was published on Kotaku, I knew that this was the style of writing that I absolutely loved. And so in part, I emulated that because I loved it and I always wanted to write like that. But any other resemblances of Chrono Trigger to Earthbound as books is coincidental because I was kind of in the dark after reading that chapter, and I just wrote. The majority of my book was finished before Earthbound was published. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting, like how quickly, like even like a little bit of subtle influence happened in that case. Like, you know, we put out just like the very first blip of something from our series, and like already that was that kind of like got you going in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of got a bit of an addictive personality like that, so you know, I can't just eat one Girl Scout cookie. I eat the whole seed with them. So when I started writing a little bit, it just became writing and writing, and I kind of didn't stop for 3 months.
Yeah.
Wait a lot, and I kept looking at new things and sending you things in installments. I felt like I was writing like Dickens. I was just trying to get paid for the word, but I think we maxed out a good 20,000 words from my total drafts. So,
yeah, it felt like a serial to me, like the way it was coming in. It was like kind of fun, and the fact that they were self-contained was like, oh, you know, here's a new chunk that I can.
There's the next one. To be continued.
Yeah, exactly. So John, same question for you.
I should have thought of that singular chunk formatting before this whole process, because that might have streamlined the book writing for me. Yeah, I guess I approached it slightly differently, and Gabe, you can chime in from the editor's perspective on this, but as far as what you can say in a book that you can't in a small article or even a long essay, I think that was the big challenge of this whole series. Like, would a book be filled with worthwhile things to say? Maybe that's why a lot of these books on games were these just exaggerated timelines, because each game didn't seem to hold enough for 150-ish pages, that in the author's minds, which was wrong. But I think that was what a lot of people maybe wondered about when they first heard of the project, and I think people were concerned. And as an author, I was worried, am I going to have enough to say? What else can I say? And of course, once I got into the process, I was looking at old files just today, and in all of the stuff that I wrote that we got rid of, whether I got rid of or you gently suggested that we set aside, there's nearly 20,000 words of stuff, so there's certainly these books, there's more than enough game for an author to talk about, but what that was, I didn't know until I was in the thick of it. I mean, I was more interested in the attempt to tell not something that I already knew, but to try to find out what else I could find out, if that makes any sense, right? Like, this is an old game.
It wasn't thesis driven. It really was like an exploration.
Yeah, and I initially wanted more of that kind of quest narrative to come out in the book itself, but I think rightly so, we dropped a lot of the kind of personal explorative work and just focus straight on the game, and I think the book is stronger for that. But my initial idea was kind of more of a like present tense, okay, here is an author that wants to find out about a game that came out 25 years ago, has a weird history. People know the tiniest little, one-line synopsis of what happened, but this was a this was a huge project. Clearly, there's more to it. What can I find out? And that was kind of the initial kernel of what I wanted my book to become. And I think there was maybe a few too many doors closed for me to really flesh out that story. So it kind of became something in between, some kind of analysis from the present, but also just looking back at his significance. And so yeah, the writing of the book was really trying to answer that question: what can I say in a book's worth of writing? And whether or not I answered that is up to the reader, I guess.
Jon, if I can jump in real quick. Jon had some access to former Nintendo employees. How hard was that, Jon, to get access to anyone? With Chrono Trigger, I didn't even pretend that I could get in touch with anyone who was on staff. I mean, I had maybe a master list, but the big name developers, the Dream Team, they would never talk to me, or I had no idea how to even contact them because I was approaching things like Twitter or Facebook and just trying to track down people, but they're not on these services. And Gabe, who is currently writing a book, had a lot of access to developers, way more than Jon and I have. So I guess someone doesn't. Jon, what was it like to try and get in touch with any of the Nintendo people? Because you had a pretty big name write your foreword as well.
Yeah, no, that was a coup. That was awesome to be able to get in touch with Howard Phillips, who was instrumental in really this game coming out, and was a part of the early Nintendo of America team. Eventually would become kind of an iconic figure at least in Nintendo Power. He was in a cartoon. I mean, that's really
the best you can get.
Yeah, once you're animated in a comic strip seen by millions of kids, that's pretty much it. But yeah, I mean, luckily the biggest names that were involved with Nintendo back when Super Mario Bros. 2 came out, they are no longer employed by Nintendo, and that's why I could touch them at all. That's why I could get in touch with them. There were a number of other names and developers and designers that I would love to have talked to that might have unearthed some of those neat little secrets that I was hoping to find. But they are they're still getting cut a paycheck by Nintendo, so they were behind that same fortress wall that you're talking about with Square employees probably. But Gail Tilden, who was editor-in-chief of Nintendo Power, and Howard Phillips, I sent them cold emails. I think I looked up Gail's information on LinkedIn, and she was there, and she has a new company now, and somehow, how did I actually get her? I think an email address was kind of publicly available, and I cold emailed her with some information about my interests, but also that I knew what she was up to now, so that it wasn't just like I was some strange kid that wanted to fanboy out about.
Maybe just a little.
Yeah, just a little bit, yeah.
Just a little bit.
But so that was just a little bit of, just kind of basic online research, and she happened to be, one, her contact info was publicly accessible, and two, she was actually quite open and willing to talk with me, which was great. And she actually helped open the door to Howard because I didn't know how to get in touch with him directly. He did kind of come out of the shadows the year before the book came out because he was trying to promote his own game project. He was coming out with this new mobile game, kind of tied into his image as the Game Master, which was his title at Nintendo, and his app was like a trivia app called Game Master's Know-It-All or something like that, and he had a Kickstarter campaign, and so he was out and about. He was a little more accessible. Unfortunately, that campaign failed, before the writing of this book, so he went back into his, private cavern, and was really hard to get in touch with. Some journalists that had talked with him, Chris Kohler, among them, helped me get, I think, maybe an address that I could reach him at, because they had a kind of a back and forth. And I just sent that message a few times. Thought we wouldn't get him, but then right towards the end of the book, the manuscript was pretty much finished, but this had transitioned from research into possible forward writing, and I just sent him one more kind of last-ditch attempt, and Gail said that they were friends, so she would send a message to him, and he just finally got back to us and was happy to read the draft, and seemed keen on writing the forward. So it was just kind of persistence and a little luck, and having a couple people that could, fish out the people that were still available, because any of the other Nintendo employees, I wouldn't have been able to talk to them.
Yeah, ultimately, like, I think that Howard and Gale added so much, and yet even like the fact that you like worked to find these other people and couldn't. I think like the caginess of Nintendo is itself a really fascinating story, and so to like watch that in your book and in others, and just kind of see people struggle to like peek behind the curtain and kind of get to, but then it goes away again, has been kind of, I see that as like a thread that kind of emerges through any of these books where Nintendo shows up. That's been really interesting. I wanted to I wanted to ask you guys too something about like what your individual game subject calls for, because it seems to me like I've noticed publishing these books that like each of the authors kind of intuits what the game needs from a book, and so with Ananthropy and ZZT, she is taking us through this game that quite a few people still don't know about, and showing us the culture of people who learned how to create games around that, and kind of telling the story of the early days of the internet and how like-minded people found each other. And so that kind of that story of community kind of became her focal point. Whereas with Darius Kazemi, for his Jagged Alliance 2 book, another game. These are probably the two so far that people kind of know the least about as a game. But he introduces the game to us through the story of its development and really focuses on how that on the like market conditions and the way the development team worked, and just every little step of the process that kind of allowed this rich game to exist. So I'd just be curious to hear from you guys on that, in terms of like what did you kind of see, both in terms of your own interest and just what it seemed like the game called for. Like what did your game seem to need from you as an author?
Okay, I'll go first.
After you.
Thank you, sir. I guess I just viewed Chrono Trigger as this kind of epic RPG. Routinely makes #1 RPG, #1 video game lists. People love this game, so it had to start from a place that was as sweeping and grandiose as the game itself. So, more simply, I kind of just threw everything at it and saw what stuck, because there were so many angles to approach it from. But the main thing I wanted to really bring perspective to was how the game text changes when it crosses boundaries. I was very interested in learning to play the game in Japanese, having played it in English, and seeing what was textually different, what had shaped perceptions of the game, and seeing how different localities would view the storyline. So the Japanese version of the game, it runs pretty much differently. Some names are changed, the plot is basically the same. Instead of a soda drinking contest, it's beer, of course, because of Nintendo's family-friendly localizations. But
Right.
I found it really interesting how the American audience saw this as religious allegory. And you can watch a really cool YouTube video that compares Lavos, who is this alien being from the sky, who's an apocalyptic beast, and they found a passage in the Book of Revelation that says he is the star of wormwood that poisons the sweet water, and I thought, wow, this is really cool allegory shaping, but none of these references exist the same way in Japanese. And a lot of the religious content was added by Ted Wolseley, who was the first translator, and those names were maintained when Tom Slattery, the retranslator, took it up for the Nintendo DS port. So I found it very interesting that Americans, English speakers, were approaching this as a thing that was religious in tone, that had so many biblical references. And to the Japanese, these things were completely absent. So it could be interesting for Gabe, who's approaching Bible games, but it didn't seem alien in a way. Those religious references weren't accurate. They weren't biblical, but they were biblical enough that it drew on our cultural memory and knowledge of stuff to say, oh, this resonates with me in a different way than it would resonate with Japanese players who got any number of puns and jokes that we didn't get. So, yeah, I really found it interesting to explore the differences between it and how Japanese players and American English-speaking players basically just experience different stories. Even though both stories are true, they're just different. So I guess I'm trying to come to grips with this idea of canonicity, games being multi-canonical, especially as the game was released so many times. It had this sort of sequel, and the sort of sequel made them make new scenes for additional ports, and just depending on when and where you played the game, you have a different idea of what the story of the game is. And I think that's true with reading books. The first edition readers of The Hobbit saw Gollum as a friendly little guy, and second edition readers of The Hobbit saw him as someone sinister. The Ring used to be something fun and magical, and then it became something sinister because Tolkien wanted to connect Hobbit with Lord of the Rings. So that sort of happened with Chrono Trigger too. Later games sort of got more connected to Chrono Cross in ways that players of the first edition did not see at all. So I was really interested in that.
It creates really interesting questions of canon and like what's the realist text? What do we go with here? And I mean, I guess John, you must see that too, right? With we've got Super Mario All-Stars, we've got Super Mario Advance, so all of which comes from the source text of Super Mario Brothers 2, which itself comes from the source text of Doki Doki Panic. So like what's the real game?
Yeah, and Michael, I'm glad you brought up the idea of other mediums being kind of elastic and reactive to time because you do see that in games and you start to think of games as the only medium that does this, but of course that's not true. You can see different cuts of films and you can see, look at Star Wars with the different special editions and things added and taken away, and it's interesting to see games maybe do that more as a part of the industry. Whether it's more frequent re-releases or hardware upgrades. In the case of Super Mario All-Stars, this was the first time when you saw the 8-bit original Mario 2D platforming games with kind of 16-bit graphics, and in one case a game that was never available to the American audience in Super Mario Brothers Lost Levels, which was the original sequel in Japan. That was one thing that I really struggled with writing this game, because just talking about the subject, the book says Super Mario Brothers 2, and that could be like 7 different things, and so just to try to answer that question, what is that title actually refer to? That was part of my interest, like, is this the American version of the game? Did we get the real version? You know, so, I mean, some of that's kind of silly in retrospect, but I think looking at it as a part of this bigger story of this franchise, which really represents this giant company that was a big part in a lot of our childhoods and a lot of our present adulthoods. You know, part of that was what I was interested in, but also just writing about it, it became a challenge to convey to the reader what each of these different things were, and that was one, I think, challenge that I had to struggle with, which maybe other had I chosen a different game, that wouldn't have been as much a part of the process, I guess. And that goes back to your question, Gabe, about you know, what did we have to bring to the game, or what did we want to you know, decipher or explore personally. And I think if I could go back, I'm happy with the ultimate product, and I'm really proud of the book that we put together. But I think it would have been interesting to choose a game with that personal connection that, say, Ken did with Earthbound, and Anna that she did with ZZT, because this game to me had less of a personal connection and more of a potential for an interesting story that I wanted to try to find. And so when that story was not as easily accessible as maybe I had hoped, then you know, then you had to kind of figure out, okay, well, what is the story here? And so it would have been interesting to go through that process with a game that really personally impacted me. It would have been just a very different process.
Yeah, although I would say that, I mean, you really ultimately found quite a bit about, like, the story of the game itself, and like what's there. You know, and that makes me kind of wonder too about, or it makes me think of a question that we have to ask in each of these books, which is, like, how much familiarity do we assume in the reader about the game? Like, how aware of the game's story are they? How much have they actually? I mean, how much do we assume that they played it? Would we assume that they played it to completion? How much do we want to, like, hold their hand, like, through this? I mean, I remember for you, John, like, in some early drafts, it kind of it sort of seemed as if, you know, you were assuming, because this is such a well-known story, like, well, everybody kind of knows about the Doki Doki Panic thing already, but you know, I mean, some people do it, some people don't. You know, like, it's just kind of. But that's the, and there's no right answer. That's what can be frustrating about it. I honestly think probably Chrono Trigger might be our book so far where we assume the most familiarity, only because, Mike, it seems like for you to talk about some of the things that you wanted to talk about in this book, you kind of, it would just be really difficult to pause and say, like, okay, this is who this character is again, and this is what's been happening, and, you know, like, you sort of, it seemed like you maybe gave yourself the freedom to be talking to people who at least had passing familiarity with the game.
Well, the way I had approached the book was from ideas, and it wasn't from a single strand like Ken did with Earthbound, which is he is the protagonist, and he will guide you through his life and through the game protagonist's adventure from start to finish, and he'll touch in at key points that happen, maybe not tell you everything that happens, but I found that was not an approach I would have been able to handle, because the game takes multiple paths. So the game that, I mean, this happens with any game's writing, but the game you play is not the game that your reader may eventually play. So in a game like Chrono Trigger, where you can make a lot of choices, you can explore side quests, you can do things out of sequence to some degree, especially in the second half of the game. Writing about it as if this is the way you play the game doesn't sound right to me, just because, well, people would say, you don't do that first. You do this first, because I did this first. And I erred at some points on that side of, well, I decided to do this. And I think I made many apologies to the reader in some cases of saying this is what should be done canonically for the game, but it's not necessarily what you do. I suppose I can apply it with Super Mario Brothers 2 because I skipped levels whenever I could. I know John wrote about not finding certain.
Why would you do it?
Because, oh my God, deserts. But
that's why the warp pipes are there, man. That's what they're there for.
With the Mario series, especially the earlier entries, I am a warp zone fiend. There are levels I've never played, but can I really say that I've played the game if I haven't played those episodes? It's like saying you've watched a TV series if you skipped a couple. Saying, well, I really enjoyed what I watched, but I did not play many of those games from start to finish, and I probably will continue to do that. With Chrono Trigger, that was a game that I did 100% completion, even though it may not have been the sequence that other people have.
Right.
That's another interesting part of dealing with games as something to critique, whether it's long form or short form. And Tom Bissell has written about this in his book Extra Lives, which was a huge influence on me in just wanting to write more seriously about games. He writes about just the logistics of having to play a game which might be 5, 10, 20, 30 hours long, and then having to speak thoughtfully about that. You have to maybe find certain parts that you want to experience again. It's not as flexible in that way as far as a music album. You can run through 45 minutes, spin it a couple times, it starts to seep in. A movie, it's 2 hours long, watch it a couple times. But you're talking about playing Chrono Trigger to completion, and that game has 12 different endings, or however many different endings.
I think 13 now.
13.
Maybe 13 if you count some other things. Probably my math is off, but there's a lot of different endings.
So that's a unique challenge to people writing about this format, I think, and for me. That was the question of how familiar the reader is. That was a huge obstacle, I think, just in general. Is this an audience that is like super crazy into games, that they absorb all that information all the time, who already know this Doki Doki Panic origin story, and who would probably buy a game or a book rather about the game itself, or is it? And I think, Gabe, this is what it seemed like you were hoping for this series to be more accessible to a more general reader's population. I wanted that the same for my book. I wanted anyone to be able to pick it up and enjoy it and kind of follow along and not have to understand all the insider information and jargon and assumed knowledge. But you go too far on one side of that, and your reader is either bored because they already know this, or totally in deep water and can't follow along. So to thread that line, I think, was constantly in the back of my mind, and a big challenge, I think. But I think you helped pull more info out of me that I didn't think was necessary, and then. And then if I had to go back and rework it, I might have I don't know, even given more kind of connection to what a more general reader would understand, because people that have read it, that have given feedback to me, more so than not, I think they've been people that haven't been as connected to games as I have, or maybe any of us have, the last few years, and they but they sought out the book just based on having played it when they were younger, and being interested. And I think for them, it was easy to maybe get lost in the minutia sometimes of and I think that's part of just the difficulty of describing gameplay too, and because it's this connection between what we're doing with our hands and what we're seeing on screen, and it's really hard to describe that. People say how hard it is to write about music, but I feel like games, it's that to the third power or something. It's just there's so many things going
Yeah.
on. So
Well,
I think that's
at least with a go ahead.
Oh, I think that was especially true with Super Mario Brothers 2 or Galaga, which is another book in the series. Games that are primarily visual and maybe some music. Because what in Super Mario Brothers 2, there is maybe a paragraph of text at the end of the game. There's a title screen and there's text at the end. The story is only explained in the manual, right? I mean, the game doesn't actually tell you the story. You have to read the manual. Of course, always read the manual. There you go.
That's right. There you go.
That's the story. The story is outside of the game. So you can play the game without knowing the story, knowing what your purpose is. You just fall from a door in the sky, and there you go. Chrono Trigger is visual, of course, because it is a game that you play on Super Nintendo. I don't think text-based games were ever that exciting for Super NES. But there's a lot to quote from, and there's a lot to explore from a narrative perspective that I can easily convey to the reader. There's text, and I can copy and paste that from someone's transcript, and I have a quote I can analyze. In the case of Super Mario Brothers 2, you're trying to make meaning from actions. When you said listening, analyzing an album for 33 1/3, most of the time you have lyrics, liner notes.
Right.
You have textual content, and it's so much easier to write about text in text. Because it's a medium that lends itself well to transcription. But, when Michael Kimball wrote about Galaga, I thought, what is the text? The text is I score, player 1, player 2. It's a game with almost zero textual content. So I would not have been able to approach a game as primarily visual with a big savior for me. That was what I wanted to do.
Yeah, me neither.
So,
Well, and Michael Kimball even has that moment in Galaga where he says, like, it didn't occur to him at the outset of writing the book how challenging it would be to write a book about a game that doesn't have a story or any text, or it's just. And then somebody else said, like, the code for Galaga is probably shorter than the text of the book about Galaga, which is like pretty fun. So and so in that case, like the what you're bringing to it, it kind of has to be this prism where you are kind of bringing yourself to the table. Otherwise, what do you talk about? Whereas, like there are kind of these, I don't know if I want to say like more objective, but there are things, there are more sources, like you say, Mike, that you can bring in to, like, from a game like Chrono Trigger, which is partially why I think, people, when they think about a book about, like, Earthbound and Chrono Trigger, they're like, oh, yeah, I could see why that would be a book. Whereas, like, with Mario or Galaga or, like, my Bible Adventures book, it's like, well, what the hell, like, are you going to spend your book talking about?
No one has ever written a book about the Bible before successfully, so this is the first time the Bible is really getting the space it needs in print.
I like giving the Bible its due. That's exactly.
Finally, at last.
Like, cool. Yeah. But I thought as kind of like a last thing to jump into, you guys both wrote for this. So it's called "Continue: The Boss Fight Books Anthology" that we just came out with. Mike, your piece you wrote just for the anthology, and it's all about bad box art, including specifically the Mega Man series and all the gloriously bad box art that comes from the original NES run of Mega Man games. So I just love to hear a little bit about where your where your interest lies in that series, and in what about bad box art is worth a big essay?
It didn't start out as bad box art. I really wanted to explore a game called Clash at Demon Head, which is people who know it know it. I think most people now know it as the name of the band from Scott Pilgrim versus the World, but it was maybe 1991. I don't have the exact year, but around there. Nintendo game published by Vic Tokai. It's a really great game. Has a lot of anime aesthetics when you play the game, but you look at the box, and the box is just so doomed. He is ripped. He's fighting these crazy monsters that look like they came off the back of action figure packages. But the in-game images are just, these cute, really happy, almost noseless animated figures. And I was really interested in seeing how that disconnect existed. And a lot of the games that I loved had this really epic box art, and the in-game graphics were often very cutesy. So I just found it very remarkable how games were being imported and resold as like American, and the games were very, very Japanese. And there's this visual disconnect, especially even if you look at like the manuals. It's always the manuals, but the art of them and the story didn't always match up to the story you played in the game. So you just had these people sloppily trying to make it more appealing to players, which were normally assumed to be boys. The art was always macho, and anime is not very macho. So you look at Mega Man, the first game, and I don't know if Gabe, maybe you can screen share that box art so I don't click on my keyboard too much here when I'm talking about it and lose my track. It's a terrible picture. It is poorly drawn. I mean, it's better than anything I could do, but it is not Rockman, who is the Japanese character, who is very cute.
Not at all.
And not at all. They are completely different, and you would not recognize them side by side as one and the same. But I just found it very interesting that we, as North American players, and the Europeans had their own box art for these, had a very different image of Mega Man going in. Ours was this guy who had a pistol, and the Japanese had a friendly little robot boy. And just like with Chrono Trigger, it's the way the thing is marketed to you affects the way you go into it. So with Chrono Trigger, maybe we had a commercial. The commercial, I think, has been since lost of time on YouTube. But Japanese players had very different marketing schemes, and the way they were introduced into the game, the visuals, were completely different. So with Mega Man, as the series progressed, we got more and more comfortable with anime aesthetics as the West gradually grew more and more comfortable with importing anime as a form of entertainment that could be recognized as a genre that was called anime. And before then, it was just Japanese cartoons chopped up, redubbed, made, Anglosphere friendly, and it was a real cultural shift. And I thought the Mega Man series, which is very historied, it's approaching 30 years now, was a good place to see the evolution of the West's evolution of comfort with anime aesthetics, going from the super macho Western image to finally just saying Mega Man is Japanese and we're going to take it as is. So I really wanted to explore that too.
Yeah, it's like the story of our catching up.
Yeah, and a bit of cultural exchange between us and Japan, the West and Japan. So I think it's an interesting story to tell.
It's like when loan words go bad or something. It's
yes, there are many loan words that go bad. I mean, imagine trying to sell a game called Doki Doki Panic in the West, or Heartthrob Panic. How are you going to sell that? It's just not going to work. Yeah. So they probably would have had that as like Arabian Adventures or something. They could have completely different title, and the art would have been very, very different.
Yeah.
If they could import that game.
Well,
right,
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to piggyback and say, I mean, that was. It's interesting too to look at these things not as just things that we play for fun, but as like cultural artifacts, and they are consumer products, and they are meant to be sold, right? So, we did play Super Mario Brothers 2 in the West because Doki Doki Panic meant nothing to American kids, and the little Arabian figures.
They were all mascots, weren't they? They were mascots.
In Japan, they were mascots for this festival, this Fuji TV like summer festival going on, and they had this big thing called Dream Factory, and those 4 characters that were this Arabian family, that was on TV, that was on commercials, that was known to kids then. It made sense that there was a game, but especially back then, this is 1980. 2007 or so when that came out, I think, in Japan. You know, now we would see that online on YouTube and understand, oh, this is a cool Japanese game, like what you're saying, are kind of catching up with the rest of the world. That stems with the technology too, right? Now we can see what's going on the other in the other hemisphere. But then, you know, we wouldn't have known what this was without the context. So it is interesting that this is. It's interesting to me that Mario in general hasn't changed that much in shift between East and West as far as the image goes. And it's pretty striking that that character, even in game boxes, has never been like, you know, Americanized, for lack of a better term, or it didn't start out as this hulking action figure. It's always been this chubby, weird, mustachioed plumber guy. It's really amazing that he's become such an mascot and icon and figure, because he was never tried to fit into that kind of stereotypical, you know, Western character, except this one game when they kept the kind of you know, cartoon cherubic image and just plastered these recognizable faces on a totally different game.
Yeah.
So yeah,
That's I mean, I think of that. That's cool that like Mario ties into that, because in both of these cases, there was a power that the box art and the peripheral art had over the presentation of the game that will just never happen again, because we don't have that gulf between the game itself and the representation of the game. That gulf isn't there. It's like, you know, if you have like the new Mario Kart, then the game looks like exactly what it looks like on the box, and it's. I mean, it's great. It tells you exactly what you're getting.
I mean, you find the Japanese images leaked online. Someone on the internet will translate it for you into English and say, "Look at these Japanese screenshots. Look at what we found." And that means the consumers already have expectations of what to expect here. So
Right.
I think the role of the localizer is changing, or maybe vanishing, and we might just have more and more translator localizers rather than marketing localizers who have to reconceive the way the game will look. In my box art essay, I talked a little bit about, you know, the Kirby series, just because the box art is identical-ish, but Kirby is always kind of pissed off in the American ones, and the Japanese ones he's always quite happy. So those are, you know, kind of these localization decisions that are made. The Americans want. You know, they want a tough Kirby, and Japan loves a happy Kirby. But he's still riding the same star on each cover. It's still the same art, just tweaked. The same way, you know, we'll have a Big Mac with certain sauce, and in Japan you can get maybe a teriyaki Big Mac promotion. It's kind of this globalization of games that starts getting tailored at local levels for those individual preferences, which I think is very interesting for us. Kind of forecasting what games we're going to get, and people are already starting to write about them when they haven't even been published yet. And then we see what we get and say, why did this change from Japanese? Or, you know, everyone's much more in on the secret now. So the stories like Super Mario Brothers 2, I think, those won't be the development history stories of the future, because they can't exist anymore. People
can't keep those doors closed.
No.
Well, we should probably start to wrap it up here, guys. So just to those of you who've been listening, if you want to check out either of their books, Chrono Trigger or Super Mario Brothers 2, they're both available on our website, on bossfightbooks.com, and also the ebooks are on the Amazon Kindle store. Love for you to check us out or follow us on Twitter at bossfightbooks. And we've got a lot of cool stuff coming up. So I mentioned my book, but also Metal Gear Solid after that by Ashley and Anthony Birch is going to be, I believe, the next one from there. And then not too far along after that is Derek Yu's book about a game that he made, Spelunky. So we got the developer himself to write the book on that, which would be like just a new cool, just a kind of a new cool take for the series. They're pretty excited about. So, thanks for listening, everybody, and thank you so much, John and Mike, for joining me here. This is really fun.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Gabe, for helping us get these books out in the world, man. It's been awesome, and I'm excited to see what happens next with season 2.
Yeah,
Yeah.
me too.
Just my last word is that I'm not done just having written Chrono Trigger. I am a pain in the ass associate editor for Gabe, always
Yeah.
checking in, seeing if he has. I'm very, very hungry to read new stuff. So, yeah, from what I'm reading so far, I think everyone has quite a few treats. Look forward to it.
Yes.
So,
Excellent.
Awesome.
Excellent.
Thank you, man. All right. Thanks, everybody.